One, two, three, four. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Welcome to Crazy Chester. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Yeah, Crazy Chester's Radio Hour. Crazy Chester's Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. My guest today is Edd Hurt. Edd is a great music writer and journalist, and besides that, just a big fan and well of knowledge for music, American music, here coming out of the South. And we'll cover all of that here in a minute, but first of all, welcome, and thanks for being my guest today, Edd.
Thank you for having me. So, are we in Nippers Corner today? Is this where we are? Downtown Nippers Corner?
We are, I guess so. That's the closest semi-known place to this house anyway.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for being here. And I would like to kick things off with how we got to meet initially, and that's through the Donnie Fritts connection. Now, a few years back, you reviewed one of Donnie's earlier album, One Foot in the Groove, and that actually, I knew about that review, and it's a great review. So, is that when you first got to meet Donnie, or how did that connection come about?
Well, let's see. I mean, back in over the last decade, Douglas Corner, it's a club in Nashville, would host sort of an annual show with Donnie Fritts, David Hood, Kelvin Hawley, the Decoys, N.C. Thurman, that band. And, you would go and you would see Dan Penn, you would see, Russell Smith of the Amazing Rhythm Aces, Billy Swan. It was sort of like this Tony Joe White, I think. There was like a summit meeting of these great soul musicians. So I would always try to make that show every year, and it was always just a fantastic thing to see. And I'm pretty sure that's the first time I really encountered Donnie, just at one of those shows. And, I worked up the courage to go up and say hello to Donnie Fritts, and he couldn't have been nicer. So I think that's really how we met initially.
Yeah, and that's been a connection, going on too, because most recently you wrote about him for the Nashville Scene.
I did, and I did a review, as you mentioned, for No Depression back in around 2008 that he'd actually read, which is very gratifying that he'd read this review. He seemed to like it. I didn't get too much wrong or anything like that. So yeah, when I got the chance to interview him last year, I kind of jumped on that because he's such an interesting guy to talk to. I mean, who else has really worked with Peckinpah and with Christofferson and with Jerry Wexler and done all these amazing things? And so I really had a ball talking to him about all this stuff. And Donnie's a great guy to interview because he's, he has all these great stories, and he has a really funny way of telling them. And, you couldn't ask for a better person just to talk to. So I was really honored to be able to, to interview Donnie Fritts back then.
Yeah, and certainly one of the most original people that there ever were, probably.
Yeah, I love songwriters too because I think songwriters are really unusual people whose minds work in a really interesting way, and I think Donnie, is like that, and I think Dan Penn is like that, and you start going down the list and you realize you're really talking to a group of very evolved, very unusual, very talented people, and Donnie's definitely one of the greatest, absolutely.
So, you've been writing about music for a long time, but how did things start for you as far as your appreciation for writing and music? How did they come hand in hand, or was one first?
Well, I mean, I was born in Clarksville, Tennessee, which is like 45 miles up the road here on the Kentucky border. And, Clarksville is more like West Tennessee or Kentucky than it is like Nashville, for example. As we like to say, there's the Clarksville, Hopkinsville, Paducah corridor, and all that, man. And, so I kind of grew up in a world where I was born in 1958, and the blues was still kind of a thing that you felt in Clarksville in a way that you don't really feel it in Nashville, for example, even. So I was lucky in that sense to experience kind of the otherness, you might say, of blues. That here in my hometown there was a substantial African American population that was to some degree a little bit segregated. Back in those days, there was a part of town and you lived in the other part of town. So I was very aware really early that there was this thing going on like blues, R&B, soul, African American music, and it was right in my backyard. So I always had a sense of that this was just around the corner from me. And later on, when I got a little bit older, we would, for example, take fishing trips up to West Tennessee to this place. It's where Carl Perkins is from, Tiptonville, up in there, the extreme northwest corner of Tennessee, Reelfoot Lake, right? And we would go fishing up there in the summer, and you could hear, at nighttime, we were sitting out kind of looking at this lake, and you would hear WLS or WSM or whatever it was, and I heard, Howlin' Wolf, and I heard Elmore James, I heard Bobby Bland, all of these blues artists kind of just coming over the radio over in West Tennessee. So I always had a feel for blues just from those experiences, and also from R&B, So I think I have a pretty typical background for a certain kind of Southerner, Andreas, who has always really loved blues and R&B. And in that sense, I'm similar, I guess, to Dan Penn and Donnie, Fritts, and all the people that I really love to write about, because I have sort of the same experience listening to country music and the stuff that's on the radio, and then this whole other world of Chess Records and Elmore James and John Brim, and the list is endless of great blues artists. So I think I was almost brought up and almost born with a feel for this music.
So how did it take you from having that feel to actually turning it into a career for yourself?
Well, writing as a career is a funny thing, as you know. I mean, it's an avocation and it's a vocation at the same time. But I always was a pretty good writer, and I wrote in high school, and I was always interested in music as a writer. And later on, when I went to the University of Tennessee. For example, I remember interviewing like Gary Burton for the college newspaper. He's a great jazz vibraphonist, and he'd come to Knoxville, and that might have been the first person I ever really interviewed. And I didn't know what I was doing, of course, and all of that. But so it came out of sort of that experience, and then, when I was doing other things, I always kind of dabbled in trying to catch up with people. And, I was talking earlier before we started about, for example, interviewing someone like Alex Chilton, which is way back in 1981, before I really ever did anything much professionally as a writer. And that was probably the first piece that I ever really wrote for a kind of a higher level publication on this show that Alex Chilton did in Nashville in 1981, this rockabilly show at Vanderbilt University. And so before this show occurred, I had gone down to Memphis with a couple of my friends, taking the typical pilgrimage to find Alex Chilton. We called him up on the phone and said, "Can we come down and talk to you?" And he said, "Well, sure." And so we meet him, and we just did the typical thing of, trying to make this pilgrimage and find this person and talk to him, which was a great experience. And it taught me that, you could just go out and do these things. All you had to do was make a phone call and have a little courage and call people up, and they would talk to you. So that sort of fed my interest in it. But really, I did some things in Memphis when I lived there in the 90s for the Memphis Flyer. I did some record reviews, things like that, just sort of dabbling in it because I had another job that was a full-time job back then. And it wasn't till around 2005 that a fellow named Chuck Eddy, who is a writer and an editor and a really great thinker on music and rock and roll, just sort of noticed some things that I was doing for this blog, for this, a discussion board about music. And I would write these things about country music and so forth and participate in these discussions. And one day said, maybe you should write for the Village Voice or something. And I'm like, well, that would be fantastic. And Chuck's always been a guy that goes out and finds, not me, but really talented people, to write for him. And he's always been really good at recognizing that and encouraging other writers. He's a great guy. And so I started writing for The Voice in like around 2005. And then I got up my courage and submitted some stuff to the Nashville Scene a year later and started writing for them. And they just sort of ballooned into kind of doing what I do today, basically. So that's really how it occurred.
So you mentioned meeting and talking to Alex Chilton in '81. Yeah. Did you experience him, and how was that, whole encounter with him? Was very much known as let's say, an interesting personality and very much of a musical chameleon.
Beyond interesting. And it's great to be able to talk about this because I've never really explained fully what happened there. And the interview itself has been used in a book on Alex that came out a couple of years ago. I've used bits of it, like when Alex died in 2010, I used some bits of that to write a little piece for the Village Voice about what I'd seen back then. But I've really never had the chance to explain just what an unusual experience that really was for all of us there. And, it was me and it was two other people, friends of mine who were both Big Star fans and Alex Chilton fans. And we went down there and we met at this place called The Well, which is what became the Antenna Club, basically. And back then it was like a biker bar. I mean, there were people playing pinball and, some heavy looking people. And it was just a weird Memphis experience, totally, and we go in there and he was with this guy named Ross Johnson, who was the drummer for the Panther Burns down there. Ross is a librarian, a drummer, a writer, and just one of the funniest people who's ever recorded anything. He's a great figure. So this is after the album Like Flies on Sherbert came out, which came out in late 1979, and we had all bought this record, and no one really knew who Alex Chilton was. That's the thing. He was a mysterious figure. There wasn't, of course, the internet. There's no way to find out many of these things, and so there was all this speculation about how is it that a guy that did The Letter and did Cry Like a Baby then does Big Star and then does something as crazy, and great as Like Flies on Sherbert. We couldn't figure this out, so we had to go talk to him. And so Ross is on Like Flies on Sherbert, so we're sitting there, and with Alex Chilton, I mean, this was a guy who had a great musical mind. And the thing about Alex that I saw then and definitely saw later was that he was just a guy who liked to experiment all the time. So it was a kind of an unusual thing to meet a pop musician who kind of had a feel for things that were commercial, but who also liked to kind of almost deliberately subvert that by experimenting all the time with it. And you could sense that's where this guy was coming from. I remember him telling us things like, I don't have a guitar in my house now, and it doesn't matter because, the music business has nothing to do with music. I mean, that was a great quote. The other great quote that Alex told us at this meeting that I use all the time, he said, we were talking about why people didn't understand Like Flies on Sherbert, which is not an easy record to understand unless you kind of free your mind of certain preconceptions about music. And he said, well, these rock critics, these Ivy Leaguers, they think that they're above rock and roll, and they think they understand it totally. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, they don't begin to get the picture of what it's all about. And when you hear that, and I was about 21 years old or something, or 22 years old in 1981, that made a big impression on me. Like, okay, I understand certain things now that I hadn't understood before. So he was just a very elusive guy. I mean, he had this voice that sounded like he had an ice cube in his mouth, and he had this drawl and this laconic thing that was really unusual and very kind of captivating in a way. You could just tell this was somebody whose mind was working in a lot of different weird directions, and he was also very just kind of elusive. But a lot of people have had experiences, as we all know later on, after this has all been sort of explicated almost to death in a way, really, the Big Star story and the Alex Chilton story. Now I meet 20-year-old, women in Kroger, and somehow we'll talk about music. We're standing in line. It turns out she's the biggest Big Star fan in the world. And you go, well, my God, that just wouldn't have happened back then. But, I think now it's pretty obvious that, he's just simply one of the greats of American music. But, he was just very elusive about things. You couldn't really get a handle on where he was coming from, because I think he was interested in so many different things. And that taught me a lot too about what being a musician almost is. I think, in my opinion, you have to be interested in a lot of things to really be a musician musically. And he sort of exemplified that.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'm always, like Big Star, how the afterlife is bigger than, what they had as far as popularity.
A lot bigger, yeah.
And that Alex Chilton's discography, or his, musical life, was probably one of the most diverse of any artists out there.
Absolutely.
I mean, between him and Miles Davis and maybe a few other people who were able to, just go where other people wouldn't go.
He taught me a lot. I mean, there are other people obviously who did the same thing. I mean, he's not alone, but he taught me a lot about, like, New Orleans music, for example.
And
Alex,
he lived there for a while.
He lived there for a while, right? And he did Willie T's "Thank You, John," this song about drugs and prostitution and heartbreak and so forth, and he single-handedly would revive songs like that would have been lost to history. So that's another thing that I really like about Alex and people like Alex, is that, they bring material back to life. That, like, he does a great version of this obscure Frederick Knight song. Frederick Knight, it's the guy who was on Stax, and he's from Alabama. This song called "Claim to Fame," that, that still lives in the repertoire because he did it. And a lot of other things too, Mr. Danny Pearson's "What's Your Sign," this ridiculous song about astrology. He turns it into this beautiful thing. So, I think it takes a lot of talent to be able to do that. And as far as the afterlife goes, I think you're right. I mean, now today, those Big Star records are all considered classics, and everyone knows them. So they have become what they should have been, which are really almost as popular as Fleetwood Mac or something, in a way. They really are. So I think it's really interesting when artists that are cult artists, and I'm sure you've experienced this yourself, that they become mainstream artists, and that's the way it should be. Everyone should just like this music. It shouldn't be a cult thing at all. So I think he had a lot of influence, not just on me, but on a lot of people who have started to realize those things. So I was really lucky to have gotten to know him a little bit and to have hung out with him a little bit.
Yeah. So you mentioned, the term pilgrimage to actually do that interview with Alex. You did different sorts of pilgrimages, I guess, to diving even further back in time and to Mississippi blues of earlier generations. How did that come about? Because you mentioned, growing up, you developed an appreciation for the sound of the country and blues.
That's right. That's right.
Did that originate then, or is it something that you discovered through like people like Alex Chilton and wanting to go back from there?
Well, I mean, yes and no. It wasn't really through necessarily Alex Chilton. It was, I mean, again, I'm sort of typical in the sense that in the 60s, in 1964, Son House and Skip James were rediscovered by these teams of blues researchers who were going down to Mississippi, and this happened simultaneously. And this is 64 when the Beatles hit. So, there was this sort of awareness of blues and earlier music having a lot to do with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the Animals and all the English and American groups who were playing blues at that time. So I was always pretty aware before I really got grown that there was blues, and I knew something about it. I mean, one of the first blues records I ever bought as a teenager was this Howlin' Wolf album with a green cover and like a jug with XXX, a moonshine jug on the cover, and it was mastered so bad that it had like this 60 cycle hum all the way through the record, and it turned out that 3 of the songs were actually by, I believe this is right, Andreas, Joe Hill Lewis. There were these great harmonica instrumentals from Memphis that were tacked on somehow to this Howlin' Wolf record. And then it was the Howlin' Wolf stuff that he had done, I guess, in West Memphis, the 1951 stuff before Chess, which I think is some of Howlin' Wolf's best music. And so I knew about that, and I knew about Elmore James, and I knew about, Bobby Bland and B.B. King and James Brown. I actually met Bobby Bland one time on his bus. He came to play in Clarksville, and he took us on his bus after the show, and Bobby Bland's, got a towel around his neck and everything. It's after the show and everything. And, we talked to him for a few minutes and got our picture taken with him and all that. So this was in the 80s. And so I had sort of as much direct experience as you could have with it, I suppose, as you could almost get at that time. If I'd lived in Memphis, obviously, I could have just found Furry Lewis, would have lived down the street, Mose Vincent, all these people, were still around back then, but I didn't live in Memphis. But, I still think it worked out pretty well. Anyway, so in the 90s, I got to know through some friends of mine who are in the book business, this guy named Stephen Kalt, who wrote the definitive books on Charlie Patton and on Skip James. And he was also a blues researcher. And he was one of the people who helped discover some of these blues guys down in Mississippi. And he was friends with Fahey, with Bill Barth, with, all these guys who were, I guess, maybe even Gail Dean Wardlow. I'm not sure about that, but he was part of that scene. He was one of the original, bluesnicks who went to Mississippi and discovered these people. And so he was writing a book on Skip James, and the guy that was kind of doing the book and editing the thing said, Steve wants you to go down to Bentonia and talk to Jack Owens, who is this guitarist who was alive back then, who played in sort of a similar style. I guess he played in drop D and all that like Skip James did, and he was still down there. So I went down to Bentonia and hung out and interviewed Jack Owens about what he remembered from the 20s, or not from the 20s and 30s, but from what he remembered from the 40s and 50s about what the blues scene was like and about Skip James. And it turned out he was a bootlegger, and he did all these other things, and he was what you call a semi-pro musician. So that was a pretty interesting experience, just to see firsthand, kind of where he lived, how he lived, what he was really like, and all the things that I'm not sure you can really experience so much anymore. So that was, again, sort of a typically, white boy in the blues experience, going to Mississippi and doing all that, and it was one of the great times of my life. So, and I think I helped out Steve with his book a little bit, and Colt, he and I were pretty good friends. I talked to him on the phone quite a bit. He got really sick toward the end of his life, and he would call me on the phone and we'd talk about stuff. And he taught me a lot about what it meant to be a writer, what it meant to be a blues writer, and about what the music really meant, because he was kind of a guy who had come through blues and come out the other end of it. So he didn't have necessarily the same views about it and their fans as you would see normally. He took what you might say was a contrarian attitude toward things, and I'd never totally agreed with some of what he was saying, but in general, it's a good thing for people to hear those contrarian views. And I suppose in my writing, I do from time to time try to put a little bit of that into the writing, just to say, we should all stop and back up and think about this a little bit more. So he was a major inspiration on me in just a lot of ways. Steve was really like an aging juvenile delinquent man, and it was always a lot of fun to be around him and just to see what he would get into. So I thoroughly enjoyed knowing that guy.
Yeah. So the more I research and the more I know how much I really don't know either. Right. Is that something that kind of rings true to you too? The more you research, the more it sparks the curiosity to learn more. Absolutely.
If you just wanted to spend the rest of your life listening to soul music or R&B from a certain period, you'd never get through all of it, right? It's impossible. So, and same thing with jazz. Gosh, there are a lot of jazz records to listen to. There's a lot of music to really explore. So I feel that every day. And it is important to never think that you know everything about it, and to be open to this experience.
Yeah. So earlier you mentioned that in the early 60s, a lot of the first and second generation bluesmen got rediscovered, and somebody else that went on his own personal pilgrimage, mainly based out of Chicago, was Michael Bloomfield.
Right.
Who, is best known for his playing on some of Bob Dylan's most iconic stuff, or Paul Butterfield's bands. Now, you extensively researched his career too, and you were participated in writing a book. You can please tell me here in a minute what exactly your involvement was. Edd Ward was the main writer of that.
That's right.
And now you're working on liner notes for a Bear Family extensive box set,
yeah,
which I am really excited.
I got to get to work on that too. That's right. Well, I was always kind of a Bloomfield fan. I knew about Mike Bloomfield way back in the 60s, because everyone had Super Session, and everyone knew about the Al Cooper connection, and certainly I knew about Like a Rolling Stone and Highway 61. I knew about I knew about the Electric Flag, Groovin' Is Easy. I remember that, kind of when it came out. I was aware of Bloomfield early on. There's a book that Rolling Stone put out of these rock interviews, Andreas, that I bought when I was maybe 13 in about 1972 or something like that. And, it had that really famous interview with Bloomfield in it from 1968, where he's talking about his career and his life. That's kind of one of the definitive Bloomfield interviews. So I knew a bit about it. I'm not saying I was an expert on Bloomfield, but then eventually, I guess this is in 2015, Edd Ward, who is a really brilliant writer who wrote in the very early days of Rolling Stone. I read Edd Ward when I was a kid in Rolling Stone, his reviews and his writing. And, he also, I believe, helped to start South by Southwest down in Austin. He's had an amazing career, and he's knows, just so much about rock and roll. And at the time, he was working on the first volume of a rock and roll history, okay? And he didn't have the time to do research for this book. And the book he had written in 1983, Bloomfield died in 1981. And Ed wrote a book on Bloomfield that came out, I believe, in 1983, and was really the first and only, the first real book on Bloomfield. There have been a couple of others since then, but this is really the first book on Bloomfield, and it went out of print just really quickly. So I got the job of just kind of going back and taking a look at the book and trying to find out some new things and do some new interviews, to write a little bit more, and just kind of bring this book up to date for 2015, 2016. And it was a great experience. I went in and just tried to interview as many of the people who had been associated with Bloomfield that would talk to me, who were still around, as I possibly could. So I talked to his brother, Alan, a lot. He's a really great guy. I talked to Nick Gravenitis of the Electric Flag, to Barry Goldberg, Joe Boyd, who had actually seen Bloomfield in Chicago before he was famous. All kinds of people who were associated with this story, all the people that I could really find. And so I think we did a pretty good job of basically just updating the book and adding some new information about what had really happened. I mean, a good example would be in the original book, Bloomfield and the Butterfield Band got taken to task by a lot of intellectuals, I guess, in the 60s, who believed the white people shouldn't play the blues. That's about as simple as you can put it. And so there's a thing in the original book where Julius Lester, who was a great writer and a great musicologist, I believe he died in the last couple of years, but I was able to talk to Julius Lester about what he really meant in the piece. That there's a famous piece or infamous piece he wrote where he's saying, that white people shouldn't play the blues and they're stealing this music. And so I went out of my way to find Julius Lester and figure out, kind of what he was really saying about that, and to kind of amplify that a little bit. Find the original article where he's really saying these things, which is in a totally obscure little journal about jazz that no one remembers, and he sent that to me. So there were just a lot of things like that were really amazing things to discover about Bloomfield. And I did a lot of research on what happened at Newport in 1965, when Bloomfield plays with Dylan and all of that, and I found out that a lot of what people thought happened didn't really happen, and that there were a lot of misconceptions. There was a book that came out right around that time by a really great music writer named Elijah Wald about the Newport Festival, and so I was able to use some of that. So, for me, it was like a really kind of a fantastic thing to do, to go back and try to figure out what really happened with Mike Bloomfield and what this was really all about, and kind of put it a little bit more into context. Edd Ward, of course, did a fantastic job of doing that because he interviewed Bloomfield. He knew him. I never met Mike Bloomfield. And my job was to just sort of take this and make it more like 2016, because there's been, as you know, a lot of scholarship and a lot of thinking about blues that it's taken it to a sort of into a new direction that you wouldn't have imagined in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, so we started this conversation off by talking about Muscle Shoals a little bit, and Bloomfield actually went down to Muscle Shoals to do an Otis Rush record.
Yeah.
What do you know about that project?
I know a little bit about it. I know maybe about as much as one could know about it at this point. He went down there with Gravenitis in either 1968 or early 1969. I'm not really sure because there are no records of it. I asked Rick Hall about it, and I asked the people at Fame about it, and there are no records of that session that I could find. There may be some somewhere, but this was kind of a session that was a little bit under the radar for Fame, frankly. It wasn't, it's a thing that really a lot of people don't remember. And I don't think Rick Hall even remembered the session because, for one thing, he didn't do it. Mickey Buckins is the guy that really did that session. And David Hood, who normally, if he'd been on that session, he has kept incredible notes of everything he's done, apparently. And he wasn't on the session, so he couldn't tell me when it happened, really. And no one could really tell me much about what happened except Mickey Buckins, who was there, who talked to me about it, and Nick Gravenitis, who produced the record along with Mike Bloomfield and wrote some of the material. He knew a little bit about it. Jimmy Johnson was on that session. I believe Dwayne Allman was on it. Barry Beckett, Mark Naftalin, who played with Bloomfield, the great blues piano player, was on the session. And then Bowlegs Miller's horn section played on the thing. So I remember Mickey telling me about, like Bowlegs and his band, shooting craps on the, in the studio and doing all these great things. Man, I'm sure it was a blast to be there, but it's still kind of a somewhat mysterious session in a lot of ways because, as I said, Rick just didn't even remember anything about it, and no one really much remembered except Mickey, and he remembered it pretty well. So what I know about it really is that Otis went down there and cut it with Bloomfield and with that band and with Dwayne Allman over a couple of days and put it out on Cotillion Records. I don't think the record did that well. It was kind of an attempt to turn him into maybe more of a soul artist or something. I'm not totally sure.
To me, it seems like a little bit similar to what they tried to do to Albert King over at Stax. Right.
I think the material just wasn't as good. And that's the difference. Albert King had Booker T and Eddie Floyd material and all that, so that was, and I guess Cropper maybe wrote for Albert King, I don't know, but the material wasn't really as good. The funny thing, and one of the things that made me try to figure out when this happened, and maybe someday somebody will just tell me, and I think we ended up doing a discography for the book, and I think we put it 1969 just out of default. I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but one of the funny things about it was that Gravenitis said to Ed Ward, and he repeated this kind of to me, is that he thought that because he and Bloomfield had gone down there and done this thing, they had sort of set this example for the Muscle Shoals rhythm section, saying that you could get away from, Rick Hall and Fame and you can go out and do your own things. And according to Gravenitis, that was the impetus for them starting Muscle Shoals Sound, which began, I think, in March of 1969 when they went across town and they left Rick. And to this day, I don't know I think there's probably some truth to that, I don't really know if it's totally true. Because my understanding, and I'm sure you know as much about this or far more than I do, that, Rick Hall had signed a thing with Capitol, and they weren't really exactly getting cut into it. So what David Hood told me is they flew up to New York to meet with Jerry Wexler, and he kind of provided them the seed money and so forth to start their own studio. So it really came almost through Wexler.
Yeah, and David actually mentioned on his podcast episode that, according to him, the most prevalent reason why they did it was that Rick wanted to exclusively bind the Muscle Shoals Rhythm section to fame. And by that time, they'd already worked for different people, and they were not really willing or able to go exclusive for him and lose all the other opportunities they had, because they already went up to New York to work with Jerry Wexler and different people.
That's right. That's right.
But sometimes I'm sure there's a lot of different elements that, will actually funnel into a decision like that.
Yeah, I think they were just ready to do their own thing. So I don't know, but I think that's all really interesting, when you look at and when you look at the fact that Bloomfield was finally down in Alabama, this place he'd read about for years, and he was there. I think that's almost poignant in a way. I think it's almost kind of sweet, that he believed in it so much. Michael Bloomfield believed in it, believed in the blues. He believed in American music too, and the other thing, I learned a lot doing that project, and I'm really proud of the way that came out, and I learned that, Bloomfield was really a polymath of a guy. When you read an interview with someone in like 1968 in Rolling Stone, and he knows who Travis Womack is, that's pretty hip, right? That's not the usual thing of a guitar player that a guitar player wouldn't necessarily say back in those days, So he really knew what was going on with all of that with guitar players. He knew who played on like the Billy Swan records. He really liked Billy Swan a lot, so he could probably sit there and say that's Chip Young and that's Reggie Young and on and on and on. So he was that kind of guy. He really it transcended blues, I guess, is the point I would make. I think that had he lived and had he been able to kind of get it together a little bit better, he would have been today what you would certainly call an Americana artist, because he was covering George Jones tunes, he was covering Randy Newman tunes, he was doing all these things that weren't really blues.
Gospel stuff, too.
Gospel stuff, yeah, the Tacoma stuff he did. Man, he just had such a range, and I think it's also a little bit of a canard to say that Bloomfield wasn't as good a guitarist as he could have been at the end of his life. I don't really think that's exactly true, because the things that I've heard him do, playing just acoustic guitar, playing this sort of orchestral thing where he's doing rhythm, and it's a lot fuller, and I think he was killing that at the end of his life. I think he was able to play. He was trying to figure out a different way to play, I guess.
I second that. And I believe that his demons probably sometimes got in the way of him being more consistent towards the end of his life. But some of the most interesting playing can be found in some of those more obscure releases towards the end of his life.
Yeah, those, right? The Norman Dayron things.
Yeah,
and
some of the Italian stuff. And it's just like,
that's right.
Maybe not as consistent, but certainly every bit as interesting.
I think every bit is interesting. And I think it shows just how much he loved every aspect of American music. He liked country music a lot. He appreciated what that was. He was probably sitting around listening to Jack Clement or to Charlie Pride and to George Jones and Winnett. He was probably just as happy to hear that as he was to hear, J.B. Hutto or Magic Sam, right? So, yeah, I think it's sad, really, that what happened there, and I hope, someday people will be able to appreciate a little bit more of what he did and not just totally miscategorize him to some degree as a typical failed white blues player. Because, there's a lot of those kind of players not failed, players, but Peter Green to Eric Clapton, you start going down the list. It's a pretty long list. So maybe someday there will be a reassessment of what he's done, and people will begin to get the picture. I certainly hope the book that I worked on with Ed Ward goes some way toward helping people to see that.
Yeah. So you just mentioned the term Americana, and pretty much all the different tangents we've been talking about here over the past hour are part of that Americana continuum, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And you just told me prior to this interview that the term Americana and this ecosystem is something you've been thinking about a lot. What are your thoughts? What is like, what's on your mind?
Well, Andreas, I mean, I think I used the word contrarian earlier, and anyone who knows me hope they know that I have a sense of humor about things. I tend to take things kind of light if I can, and I tend to have my own. And I think this is true with writers and people. And I'm certainly not the only one, but I mean, I kind of have my own opinion about what's going on with Americana, and I've covered it for like 12 or 13 years now, because when I first started writing for the Nashville Scene, I've been a freelancer for the Scene since 2012. I'm not a staffer, but I've done a lot of work for them since maybe 2005, 2006, and I covered the Americana Fest back in, I guess, 2005 for the first time. So I got to see a man like Solomon Burke. I remember seeing Bobby Bear. All these people at that Americana Fest. So I've covered it since 2005. And I've covered the festivals. I've written about the artists. Weekly in the Scene. I've almost kind of gone out of my way to cover a music that, being the contrarian that I am, I can't say that I totally am in sympathy with in many ways. And that's all to the good, because after all, as a writer, if you can only write about the things that you totally agree with, you're going to run out of things real quick. Even if you like as much music as somebody like me or like you're gonna run out of subjects. So
you can only write so many love songs.
You can only write so many love songs and so many love letters to people. And of course, you're not in it to be a contrarian, but given my particular background as a person who really has always liked, jazz, R&B, blues. I like Latin music. I like. I'm a big rock and roll fan. I'm a big sort of pop fan. I mean, how do I put this? I mean, I used to tell people, they'd say, where in the world are you coming from, man? Sometimes they would get sort of peeved at me because I was upending some of their preconceptions or their notions about what they thought about Americana and about American music. And I would say, well, look, man, the music of August Starnell and Dr. Buzzard's original Savannah band has probably meant more to me than the combined works of Guy Clark and Townes Van Zandt ever could, which to them was like a sacrilegious thing to say. Like, oh my goodness, you mean you like disco better than you like Guy Clark? And I'd be like, well, yes and no. It's not a matter of liking it better. It's a matter of what music does what. I think that they both have their place in what you would call, you said, the ecosystem of music. So that's, sort of where I've always been coming from, as opposed to someone who just naturally gravitates toward the Texas singer-songwriters, toward, Guy Clark and Van Zandt and Robert Earl Keen and Willis Allen Ramsey and, who are some of the others? I mean, start going down the list. There are quite a few of those people. And my journey as an Americana writer has been to learn to appreciate this a lot more, and which I certainly have. I ended up interviewing Guy Clark, for example, a couple times, and he's a great figure, absolutely. But I think that Americana really comes out of the experience of people who are exactly my age. because all the people I worked with on No Depression were born around 1960, in the early 60s. They came up through regular old rock and roll, from the Beatles to Neil Young to Mott the Hoople to whatever. But then in the late 70s and early 80s, punk happened and new wave happened. And I feel like the sensibility of Americana comes from the experience of people who were sort of that age, and they got kind of thrown for a loop by punk rock and by new wave. And then down the line, people started to figure out that, well, you can combine this the aesthetics of punk and new wave with sort of what happened in country music and in sort of alternative country, you know what I'm saying? So, for example, to me, London Calling by The Clash is an Americana record, because what are they writing about? They're writing about America. They're writing about Jimmy Jazz. They're writing about, this experience they're having with American music that's been filtered through their experience as punks, And you could say the same thing about the Mekons, Fear and Whiskey. That's about 1985. That's an Americana record. They're Europeans grappling with this idea of country and trying to figure out how they relate to that. And Elvis Costello's King of America, right? I mean, that's James Burton and all the cats that played on all those records that Elvis Costello listened to when he was growing up, and that's the very title, King of America. To me, that's where Americana begins. It's the sensibility of these people. It's, Jason and the Scorchers, the same thing in Nashville. I mean, they're trying to combine what they think is punk rock and what they think Hank Williams is, and put this out into the world. And so it's really, in some ways, if you want to simplify it, you could say it's just country punk. I mean, that's where it comes from. And so I don't really share the views of people who think that it's just alt country with a new name and with a new hat and a new beard. I think it's a little bit more than that. And I think maybe what you're seeing now in Americana, which is a very eclectic, very syncretic, very far-reaching, kind of music, that kind of bears out what I think is happening, that they're trying to combine a certain root sensibility with rock and roll or punk or something. I mean, they're trying to marry these things together, in a way that can reach a new audience. So I think initially it really does come out of the experience of people who were kind of shocked into this awareness of with punk rock and with new wave. That's my take on it. So I think it's changed a lot since then. I think it's not really that anymore. I think it's a lot of different things. You should ask me about what I think about the political aspect of Americana. You want to talk about that? I mean, we're here,
We can go anywhere, absolutely.
Yeah.
I
mean, I think it's a political thing. I think it's a political music. And I think that, from my perspective, I'm just such a realist about music, Andreas. I'm not an idealist about music. Whatever people do is what they do, and you can just describe it. You can't change it. I mean, I think that, and I don't think this is true across the board. There are a lot of wonderful people in Americana, wonderful people who promote it. I know a lot of them. I'm not the kind of guy that just is going to say this is nonsense or this is lame. And a lot of people who are similar to me in my taste and sensibilities, they would just say it's kind of lame. It's like an imitation of roots music. And I don't really agree with that. I definitely think it's more than that. But, there's a political aspect to Americana that is sort of exemplified by a story I'll tell. I mean, I wrote a piece on the last Americana Fest, and I was reviewing, I don't know, maybe it was, there's a woman named Lily Hyatt, who's John Hyatt's daughter, who, if you listen to her music, it sounds like David Bowie. It sounds like Roxy music. And I like David Bowie and Roxy Music, but the last time I looked, they're not Americans. I don't know. I mean, okay, that's fine. And so I was just kind of doing a typical writerly thing of saying, well, look, if you're saying that Americana can be Lily Hyatt channeling Roxy Music or something, you know, why is it that Americana doesn't recognize, why is it that Americana recognizes Irma Thomas and, let's see, Don Bryant, you know, man, William Bell, Betty LaVette, Stax in general. I mean, all that kind of 60s soul music. Otis Redding would be, you know, all of that could be considered sort of a touchstone to them. Why is it then that they don't recognize George Clinton or Funkadelic? You know, why does it stop somehow?
Or jazz in general.
And jazz in general. A very good point. That's what I'm saying. I mean, why is it that Americana seems to exist in a vacuum where hip-hop music, which is by far the most popular music in the world, a music of completely global influence, and you just mentioned jazz, and that's a very important point because, you know, jazz, kind of like blues and like a lot of other music, it's fallen on hard times lately. It's not a very popular music anymore. It became, you know, like a specialist music and almost a museum piece in some ways. I mean, you have to face that. And what's keeping jazz alive in many ways is the influence of hip hop and electronic techniques. I mean, I just heard a great record by a group of, I think it's called Mast, this group, and they're doing monk tunes, and they're doing them in a post-hip-hop kind of glitchy, kind of electronic way that's fantastic. It's fantastic, you know. And Esperanza Spalding, she's a hip-hop influenced jazz artist who is taking the music in new directions, and she's popular. So why is it that Americana can't get with that? I mean, why? What is the logic behind liking one kind of Black American music but saying another kind of Black American music doesn't fit into this picture? And there's no answer to it because there's no reason for them to do it. It's just, quite frankly, their inability maybe to see what's really going on. And I back this up by just a conversation I had with a very smart guy that I used to work with in the No Depression days, this guy's a smart dude, you know. He's my age, he's up on everything. I mean, he's a smart fellow. But he told me after I wrote this piece, he didn't like the piece. He was like, well, why do you always have to bring up hip hop, Ed? What is this? What purpose does that serve? And furthermore, I don't think that hip hop is anything but sort of inimical, you know, damaging to country music. What does hip hop have anything to do with country music? It seems like this is helping to destroy country music. And there are a lot of people who think that. Because when you listen to country, man, it's hip hop influence. There's no doubt about it from the very basis of it. And I had to say, well, look, you know, have you ever been to West Tennessee and seen people listening to what they listen to in the radio? They're listening to Keith Urban and to Maren Morris and to, Florida Georgia Line, and to go down the list of modern country. And they're also listening to hip hop. That's what's on the radio. Those are the two things they listen to. So how is it that the actual audience for country music likes hip hop, and the people who make country music incorporate it into their music? How is it you're saying that it's damaging to country when they like it and they use it? And he really just didn't have much of an answer, except that that's just not his world. And I don't think that's, unfortunately, the world of Americana. That's why I think it's a political thing, because you're embracing one thing, you're cutting another thing off, and there just isn't any reason for it, you know, to me, Andreas. Now, I mean, I know that Americana is a marketing scheme as much as it is a kind of music.
Absolutely, and I feel like whenever you label something, there's a blessing and the curse labeling something too. You want to define something, to give a description of a certain thing, but by doing that, by definition, you exclude other things.
Sure, and maybe that's just the nature of things. So, I mean, I'm not knocking it. I mean, it's just something that's interesting to point out, because after all, I like music and I like being an American and being, as we started this conversation, where am I from? I'm from the South, so I like country music and I like James Brown and I like everything. I mean, that's to me, it's all part and parcel of what this is about. And I don't really think that even hip hop, which is a different thing, let's face it, it's a different kind of approach to music in many ways, but I like that too. So I don't see the why you have to make these distinctions. And so I think it does come down to marketing more than it comes down to Americana is not a kind of music. It's a term given to a kind of music in order for you to be able to understand it as a marketing scheme. And I have nothing against that at all. I mean, we've all got to make money and that's the way it is. But, when you look at it in the broader range of things, it does seem like you might say, some contradictions at work.
Yeah. And I like, talking about it, because talking about it makes us reflect those issues and maybe actually get us to a more informed space, which I think is always a good thing. So we're almost at the end of our conversation. I sure appreciate you sharing all your knowledge. Let's, to close this off, kind of bring it back from the big spectrum to small. And we're here in Nashville. One artist you recently covered, and one artist that I love, is Kevin Gordon.
Kevin Gordon.
And Kevin he's not Nashvilleian, but he's been here for a while.
That's right.
And he's very much an eclectic guy himself. I'm bringing up as a just an example of somebody kind of existing in his own space, being very great, not necessarily as well known as he should be. Do you have any personal favorites that you would like to turn other people on to?
I thought maybe you'd ask that, so I did actually think about this a little bit before I came down. And you mentioned Kevin. Kevin Gordon is great. I mean, he's one of the best songwriters in Nashville. I really like what he does a lot, and I think, I would really almost say that Kevin Gordon is a guy who, and I know this will sound, again, I'm a contrarian, so you just have to bear with me here. I think Kevin Gordon is a good example of what Nashville can do, and in a smaller way, but a significant way, an example of what Nashville sometimes isn't very good at, and I think this goes back to Americana and people's expectations of an artist. I mean, he's definitely, Chilton Shine, his last few records, man, I met him in Americana and I just told him, I said, there's a song called The Drunkest Man in Town on that last record. I mean, boy, what a great song. That song should be popular. It should be on the radio. I mean, that's, you're a better person for hearing what Kevin Gordon has to say. He's fantastic, but I don't think that he's totally, and I hate to say this, but he's just not totally being well served by certain aspects of what Nashville does. And I'll get to some other favorites in a minute, but I think it's an example of the limitations that Nashville puts upon itself, that they don't need to be putting on, that they don't need to be putting on themselves, because the production on Kevin Gordon records, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily do it that way, is about the best I can say, and it's the politest way I could say it. I'm not saying it's necessarily terrible. I think it's okay, but this is a guy that needs to be produced in the biggest way, and he needs to be as well produced as Bobby Charles was. Okay, and you know, I love Bobby Charles, and I think he's as good as Bobby Charles, man. He is every bit as good, and that's the highest praise I could give. So that's kind of an East Nashville Americana thing, in a way that, you know, they're afraid of pop music. They're afraid of just being popular. I'm convinced of that. So there's a fallback position that they just crawl back to all the time, sort of like this foxhole of, you know, country music and this notion of authenticity or integrity and, you know, being an artist as opposed to just being a popular musician. And I think the production on his records is okay, but if there was a slight difference in approach, I think he would be more popular. He deserves to be. So I think that's just a very typical Nashville attitude, and that gets back to the dichotomy between country, which is just meant to be popular, and Americana, which is trying to be something else, which is hard for me to grasp. You know, they're intentionally almost trying to not be popular or something. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's my take on him. And a general thing that happens over there in East Nashville. I've always felt that. That said, I'm a big fan of, you know, heck, Elizabeth Cook, man. I've known her for a long time. She's real good. I think Todd Snyder is a mad genius of music. He's completely insane, but he's a genius. He's really great. You know, as far as Nashville goes, I mean, Amelia White is good in East Nashville, sort of that sort of thing. I like, obviously, I like Isbell. I like, you know, Gillette Johnson's pretty good. I mean, there's a band in Nashville that's kind of under the radar that I got to mention that I really like a lot. Lou Turner and the Styrofoam Winos. I think she is great. I think she's a very unusual, interesting songwriter. I like Tim Carroll in East Nashville. I think he's great. At the same time, Andreas, because I cover, you know, rock bands here all the time. I go to places like the East Room, the Cobra, you know, and you see rock bands that are all these people are under 30 years old. They're kind of playing rock and roll music. A band like Idle Bloom is really great, for example. They're kind of a rock band. There's a guy named Connor Cummins who is in this band called Spodie Boy that I think is great. He's like just this confrontational sort of punk. I think he's fantastic. My friend Steve Polton, who's been around forever. I'm a huge fan of his work. You know, I like Paul Birch. I think he's good. You know, who's played with Kevin. You know, there are a lot of people kind of doing this great work in Nashville. And I think some of it is coming from the rock and roll side of it. I mean, there's a kid, and I say kid because he can't be more than 20 years old or something, that I discovered just at this show, named Isaac Q. Horton, Andreas, who's the most unlikely looking sort of rock star you could see on stage, but he's in a band that he calls Ivan, and he's totally original. I mean, the rules don't mean anything to a lot of these younger people. They're out there trying to break the rules and make new rules. So I really admire, I mean, so many people in Nashville, there's so many great talents working here just every day, you know, from the old school to the kind of the new school, you know. Annie McHugh. I mean, I think Annie McHugh is the baddest guitar player I've ever seen in my life. Every time I see her, I mean, she's everything you could want in a musician, and you can multiply that by 1,000. So I'm real lucky to be here and to be acquainted with and to be friends with and to participate in kind of this thing that's happening in Nashville, which is truly unprecedented. I mean, Kurt Wagner, Matt Swanson, Chris Davis, my friend Chris Davis, who is doing an incredible job of bringing music to Nashville and things that are experimental that you would not normally see. These are the people that I really have just a ton of respect for, and I'm just really proud to be part of the process in the ecosystem of Nashville to let people know about what's going on. So, I mean, do you want to name some of your favorites before we go? You got any favorites?
Well, I do have some favorites. It's interesting though, just hearing you talk, and we live in the same town, and there were at least 3 or 4 names you mentioned I've never seen live, and it certainly makes me want to check them out. And
that's the thing, yeah.
See what they're doing. It's like I've been just kind of rediscovering people more recently than discovering new people. I'm on this mission right now where you mentioned Billy Swan, Donnie, Fritts, and some of those guys, as far as their writing ability or their performing ability, they're very much still on the top of their game. But they don't get, or they choose not to make records. And to me, it's almost like a library that could exist that doesn't. And I'm more on a mission to say, hey, Billy Swan, can we make a record? Hey, can we? To me, it's like, that's what I'm interested in right now. It's like, you're one of the most significant artists in my, kind of my life. I want more of you. And then as such, making that available to other people so other people can see the evolution of those artists. I think artists usually, if not anything, happens or they die, they get better, or they get more mature, or they get more interesting. And it's a little bit of a shame that a lot of these people, for whatever reason, don't make records.
I totally agree. I think that Billy Swan should be making records. Of course, you put out that great, you helped facilitate, I guess, that record with Buzz Cason in some way, and that's great. I really enjoy that record. Rob Galbraith is still around, and he's a friend of mine. I always go see Rob Galbraith when he does his show. Matt Gaden's still around. Wayne Moss is still around, still running his studio. I've seen Wayne Moss in recent years playing with bass out at the Midnight Jamboree, for example, just playing bass with people. I mean, Bergen White is still alive in Nashville. I mean, and doing good work. Bobby Braddock. I mean, there's a lot to the history of Nashville, I guess, that people aren't super aware of, and maybe they should be. And people like Billy Swan. So yeah, I think that I think gradually those people are being recognized more, because it's a lot more diverse here than people usually give it credit for. When you start looking at the bigger picture, usually, I mean, I don't even get autographs from people. I mean, I think I got Dan Penn's autograph because I'm not completely crazy. I figured I wanted to get Dan Penn's autograph. Okay, I get some autographs, but I'm not an autograph hunter. But I went up to Billy Swan one time, and I had the copy of his 3rd record on Monument. I think it's a masterpiece. And I went up to him like a little puppy dog and just said, "Mr. Swan, you are the greatest. I love this record." He just kind of looked at me like, "All right, son," and signed this record, and I mean, I don't think these guys realize how much people like you and me appreciate them. And I mean, because they really don't always understand, because they're just working guys, that how much they've contributed to Nashville, And so I think it's really important to do what you're doing, to try to bring them back to attention. I know for example, Steve Kahn, right? That guy's very underrated.
Yeah, he was in here last week.
Yeah, I know. I meant to come out and see that, actually, because I love Steve Kahn.
He'll be at Douglas Corner Monday night.
You going to go?
Absolutely.
Well, let's go.
7:30.
7:30. And Nashville, you got to be there too, because this guy's great, right?
He is the real deal for sure.
Great piano player, great songwriter.
Absolutely. Very underrated too.
Very underrated.
Anyway, I like to just stop it here. Thank you so much for spending this last hour with me. I learned so much, and thank you so much for sharing all that.
Thank you. Thanks for
And,
having me. It's been a total gas, man. It's been great.
Well, I appreciate that. That's mutual, and I wish you all the best with whatever might come your way, including that Bloomfield box set liner note project.
Yeah, I'm working on a couple of other things that I hope will come to fruition. So one must just keep working at it. That's really the point, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you again so much.
Thank you. This was the 39th episode of the Crazy Chester Radio Hour. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please make sure to subscribe to the Crazy Chester Radio Hour podcast on iTunes, or check it out on YouTube, SoundCloud, TuneIn, or Stitcher. That's it for today. See you next week.